My boyfriend told me about his type in guys and it's making me too insecure to be intimate with him. For context, let me start from the beginning. I've been dating Jay for what feels like 8 months, give or take, depending on how one defines the moment we officially crossed the invisible line from seeing each other till we're a couple. Jay is amazing. From the start, he was everything I could have hoped for in a partner, kind, attentive, and quietly confident in a way that made him seem unshakable. He has this way of listening, truly listening, that makes you feel like you are the only person in the world that matters. And when he smiles, it's not just a smile. It's the kind of smile that you'd swear could brighten the bleakest day. But there's one thing about Jay that I didn't know at first. He's bisexual. Not that it was a secret, far from it. It just didn't come up right away. And honestly, looking back, it wasn't like he intentionally withheld it or tried to downplay it. It was just him. A part of his identity that existed in the background, quietly but undeniably, like a star in the night sky. When he finally mentioned it, it felt more like a casual aside in the flow of one of our many conversations than a grand revelation. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't earth-shattering. It just was. I remember the moment clearly, though. We were curled up on his old, slightly sagging couch, a mix of empty takeout containers and half-finished cups of tea scattered around us. We had been talking for hours about everything and nothing. The conversation meandered in that way conversations often do when you are deeply comfortable with someone, and suddenly, the topic of past relationships came up. That's when he told me, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, as though he were recounting what he'd had for breakfast. "I'm by the way," he had said. And then, without missing a beat, he reached for another bite of cold pad thai like it was the most natural thing in the world. And it was natural. At least, it felt that way to me. I didn't flinch, didn't question it, and certainly didn't feel uneasy. If anything, I admired him for being so open, so comfortable with himself. I said something casual like, "Oh, cool," and asked him a bit more about his journey to discovering that part of himself. He answered thoughtfully, but not with the same enthusiasm he had when talking about his favorite books or his dream to backpack through Europe. It was clear that while he wasn't ashamed, it also wasn't something he enjoyed discussing. It was personal, a quiet part of who he was, not a loud declaration he wanted to make to the world. And that was fine by me. I never felt the need to prod or dig deeper than he was willing to share. To me, Jay was Jay, funny, kind, and full of this gentle warmth that made me feel safe. I didn't see him as my bisexual boyfriend. He was just my boyfriend, and that label felt complete all on its own. In the months that followed, our relationship blossomed in ways I hadn't anticipated. We fell into a rhythm that felt effortless, like we'd been syncing our lives together for years rather than mere months. Jay wasn't just sweet, he was supportive in ways that mattered. He encouraged my goals, listened when I needed to vent about my endless pile of coursework, and knew exactly when to pull me out of my own head with his easy humor. He had this uncanny ability to balance being serious and light-hearted, a talent I envied and adored in equal measure. But the thing that drew me to him the most was his sincerity. When he complimented me, it never felt like he was saying it just to say it. When he held my hand, his grip was firm but gentle, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jay made me feel seen. Truly seen. And for someone who often struggled with self-doubt, that feeling was nothing short of intoxicating. I didn't dwell on his bisexuality much. It wasn't a big deal, not to me, at least. Sure, I occasionally wondered what it might be like to date someone who had the capacity to be attracted to both men and women, but those thoughts never lingered long. Why should they? Jay was with me, and I was with him. It felt simple and secure. Or at least, it did at the time. So, flash forward to the week before last. It was one of those cozy evenings that felt like it was made for just the two of us. We'd ordered pizza, half pepperoni, half veggie, because Jay insisted that I couldn't go a single meal without some greens and settled into his couch, which, despite its years of loyal service, was still lumpy and not quite comfortable enough. But it didn't matter. Being with Jay made everything else feel secondary. We decided to watch a film, though honestly, I can't even remember which one. Something mainstream, with enough action to keep Jay entertained and just the right touch of romance to keep me invested. As the story unfolded on screen, we made little comments here and there, the kind of inside jokes and observations that come naturally when you are comfortable with someone. I don't think I laughed that much at the actual film, but at Jay's running commentary, I was in stitches. Somewhere in the middle of it, one of the characters, a guy with that classic rugged charm, caught my attention. Not because I found him particularly attractive, but because I wondered if Jay did. It was a thought that popped into my head out of nowhere, uninvited but insistent. Until then, I hadn't really thought much about the specifics of what Jay might find attractive in other people. It just wasn't a topic we'd dived into before. So, in a moment of curiosity that felt as natural as breathing, I turned to him and asked, "Do you think he's attractive?" Jay glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing ever so slightly as he studied the character. "Nah," he said after a beat, shrugging. "Not my type." That answer should have satisfied me, but instead, it left me with more questions. What was his type? Was it vastly different from mine? Did it overlap? The curiosity bloomed into something I couldn't ignore, so I pressed further. "What is your type, then?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, though my heart started to beat just a little faster. To my surprise, Jay didn't shy away from the question. In fact, he leaned into it with a level of detail I hadn't anticipated. He described his ideal type in men, painting a vivid picture with words. He talked about the features that caught his eye, the kind of voice that melted him, the way confidence could radiate from someone without feeling overbearing. He even mentioned specific quirks like a certain kind of laugh or the way someone might fidget with their hands when they were nervous. It was surprisingly specific, almost poetic, and so unlike the things I typically noticed in people. I listened intently, nodding along as he spoke. At the time, I wasn't upset, not even a little. If anything, I was fascinated. The way Jay described what he found attractive in men was so different from what I found appealing. It was like getting a glimpse into a part of his mind that I hadn't explored before, and I found it endearing. I couldn't help but smile at the way his eyes lit up when he talked about it, the way his hands moved as if he were trying to sketch his thoughts in the air. When the conversation naturally tapered off, we turned our attention back to the film. But my mind kept circling back to his words, replaying them like a song I couldn't get out of my head. It wasn't a bad feeling, not then. It was just new. A different perspective, a shift in how I saw Jay, like discovering a hidden room in a house I thought I already knew inside and out. By the time the credits rolled, we were both fighting off yawns. I stretched, letting out a contented sigh, and reached for my phone. "I should head home," I said, reluctantly pulling myself up from the couch. "You sure you don't want to crash here?" Jay offered, his voice laced with that soft, sleepy warmth that always made me second-guess leaving. I hesitated for a moment, but the idea of my own bed won out. "Thanks, but I think I'll sleep better in my own space," I said, giving him a small smile. "Plus, we're only a few minutes apart. It's not like it's a trek." He walked me to the door, as he always did, and we shared a quick kiss before I stepped out into the crisp night air. The walk home was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that let me process the evening. I thought about our conversation, turning it over in my mind. I wasn't upset, I told myself again. It was just interesting. Insightful, even. But somewhere, buried deep beneath the surface of my thoughts, a tiny seed of insecurity had been planted. I didn't notice it then. Not really. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a whisper at the back of my mind. But that whisper would soon grow louder, and louder still, until it was impossible to ignore. For now, though, I pushed it aside, letting the warmth of J's words and the memory of his laugh carry me through the quiet night. Everything was fine. At least, that's what I told myself. And for a while, I believed it. The next time we met up was a few days later, for drinks with some of our friends. It was the kind of night that usually made me feel alive, an evening filled with laughter, shared stories, and the comforting hum of camaraderie. The pub was dimly lit, the kind of place where the chatter of other patrons blended into a cozy background noise. Jay and I arrived together, and as usual, he had that easy charm about him that drew people in. It wasn't just me who adored him, everyone seemed to. His presence had this way of making everything feel just a little bit better, like he carried a pocket of warmth wherever he went. We settled in with our group, drinks in hand, the conversation bouncing from topic to topic. For a while, everything felt normal, easy. I laughed at a joke someone made, leaning against J's shoulder in that familiar, casual way that felt so natural. But then, as I glanced around the room, something caught my eye. A guy standing near the bar. He wasn't remarkable in any obvious way, but there was something about him that snagged my attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the way his broad shoulders filled out his shirt. Whatever it was, my stomach sank the moment I saw him, because he looked almost exactly like the description Jay had given of his type. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But the more I watched the guy, his easy smile, the way he leaned in to talk to his friends, the more my chest tightened. My mind began to spiral, the words Jay had spoken days ago replaying in my head. Is this what he really wants? Is this the kind of guy he'd find irresistible? What does he see when he looks at me? I couldn't stop the flood of thoughts. They came fast and unrelenting, each one twisting the knife of doubt just a little deeper. My throat felt dry, my palms clammy. I tried to focus on the conversation happening around me, but it was like trying to tune out a blaring siren. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "I'll be right back," I mumbled, my voice barely audible over the din of the pub. I slipped away, heading straight for the bathroom. Once inside, I leaned against the sink, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, willing myself to calm down. This is ridiculous, I told myself. You're overreacting. Jay loves you. He's with you. But the logic didn't stick. The insecurity was too loud, drowning out reason with its relentless whispers. After a few minutes of deep breaths and shaky resolve, I forced myself to leave the bathroom. When I returned to the table, Jay looked up at me, his brow furrowed in concern. "Hey," he said softly, leaning closer. "Are you okay?" I plastered on a smile, hoping it looked convincing. "Yeah," I lied. "Just stressed about college stuff." He studied me for a moment, his dark eyes searching mine. For a second, I thought he might push the issue, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, squeezing my hand gently under the table. That simple gesture should have reassured me, but instead, it made me feel worse. He cared about me, trusted me, and here I was, drowning in a sea of baseless insecurity. We stayed at the pub for another hour or so before heading back to my place. The walk home was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Jay held my hand, his thumb brushing against mine in that absent-minded way he always did, but I was too lost in my own thoughts to appreciate it. When we got to my apartment, he followed me inside. We kicked off our shoes, shedding the chill of the night as we moved to the couch. He sat close, his arm draping over my shoulders as we talked about nothing in particular. I wanted to be present, to enjoy the moment, but the image of that guy at the bar lingered in my mind like a shadow. At some point, Jay leaned in to kiss me, and I let him. His lips were warm, familiar, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of the connection we always shared. But then he started to undo the buttons of my shirt, and that flicker was snuffed out by a wave of insecurities so overwhelming it felt like I was drowning. My body tensed, and I pulled back slightly. He paused, his brow creasing in confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with concern. I think I had too much to drink," I blurted out, the words tumbling from my lips before I could stop them. It wasn't true I'd barely had 2 drinks, but it was the only excuse I could think of in the moment. Jay didn't press me. He just nodded, his expression softening. "Okay," he said, standing up. "Let me get you some water." While he was in the kitchen, I curled up on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest. The guilt was suffocating. He was being so kind, so understanding, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. When he returned with the glass of water, he placed it on the table and kissed my forehead before saying good night and letting himself out. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a rush of relief followed almost immediately by shame. I didn't want to push him away, but I didn't know how to let him in, either. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, the weight of my insecurity pressing down on me like a physical force. I told myself I'd feel better in the morning, that it was just a passing moment of self-doubt. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. We saw each other 2 more times after that night, and both times ended up feeling like déjà vu, an unsettling cycle I couldn't seem to break. The first time, I clung to the same strategy I'd used before: make an excuse, deflect, avoid. I could tell he was disappointed, though he tried to hide it. His soft "it's okay" and the way he stroked my hair as we sat side by side only deepened my guilt. I hated myself for pulling away, but the tightness in my chest was suffocating. No matter how much I told myself that I was being irrational, the doubts refused to let go. The second time was worse. I thought I could push through it, fake my way back to normalcy, but I was wrong. We were at my place again, the room dimly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. Jay leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in that way that used to make my heart race. I kissed him back, trying to will myself into the moment, but it was no use. The insecurities were still there, louder than ever. Every touch, every movement felt like a spotlight shining on my flaws, my perceived inadequacies. I felt shy and small, like a child pretending to be an adult. When he touched me, all I could think about was that guy at the bar, or worse, the imaginary parade of men who fit his type better than I ever could. My mind was so crowded with these thoughts that I couldn't feel anything else. I tried to go along with it, hoping that maybe, if I just kept moving forward, I could silence the voices in my head. But it didn't work. I wasn't present, and he could tell. It ended quickly, awkwardly. The air between us felt heavy, tense. He didn't say much afterwards, just held me for a while before eventually getting up to leave. I could see it in his eyes, the confusion, the hurt. He didn't press me for an explanation, but I knew he was wondering. Was I pulling away because I didn't want him anymore? Was there someone else? The thought of him believing that made my chest tighten even more. I wanted to scream, to tell him that it wasn't true, that I cared about him so much it physically hurt. But I couldn't find the words. When the holidays came, we went our separate ways, each heading to our respective families in different countries. The distance gave me time to think, but thinking only seemed to make it worse. Every time I replayed the past few weeks in my mind, the guilt and anxiety twisted deeper into me. I wanted to fix it, to explain everything, but I didn't know how. The idea of being vulnerable, of admitting to him just how insecure I'd been feeling, terrified me. What if he thought I was being ridiculous? What if he resented me for making this about me when he hadn't done anything wrong? I kept imagining all the ways the conversation could go wrong. Maybe he'd get frustrated. Maybe he'd think I didn't trust him, or worse, that I was accusing him of something. The thought of seeing disappointment in his eyes, disappointment directed at me, was unbearable. And yet, every time I thought about not telling him, about continuing to hide this from him, my chest grew tighter, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he thought I was cheating? What if he thought I didn't love him anymore? The truth was, I loved him more than I had ever loved anyone. That was what made it so hard. He was kind and thoughtful, the kind of person who didn't deserve to be hurt by my insecurities. And yet, here I was, hurting him anyway, silently, unintentionally, but still undeniably. I spent the holidays caught in this endless loop of self-doubt and guilt. Every time my phone buzzed with a text from him, my heart jumped. His messages were sweet, casual, the kind of thing that should have made me smile. But instead, they made me feel like a fraud. How could I respond to his kindness when I felt like I was failing him so completely? One night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through the mess of my emotions. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't keep pushing him away, couldn't keep hiding how I felt. If I wanted this relationship to survive, I had to face the thing I'd been running from. I had to tell him the truth. The thought was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. Maybe, just maybe, he'd understand. Maybe he'd see that my insecurities weren't about him, but about me. Maybe he'd remind me of all the reasons he chose me in the first place. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd be hurt, or angry, or confused. But if I didn't try, if I didn't give him the chance to understand, then I'd already lost him. As I lay there, my chest tight with both fear and resolve, I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling slightly, before I began to type. "Hey," I wrote, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding in my ears. And then, with a deep breath, I hit send. Whatever happened next, I told myself, I wouldn't run away from it. Not anymore.